today we are looking at women in art in prehistoric and Mesopotamian periods. So for the topics here, I won't go over them. They're there if you want to look. So we're going to look first at hunting and gathering societies and women's roles within those societies. So the earliest peoples in the prehistoric period were hunters and gatherers that were nomadic groups. And what nomadic means, of course, is that ultimately that they moved around to follow animal trails. So they didn't stay in one place. You have a couple different, you have nomadic, semi-nomadic, and sedentary. Nomadic is where you're constantly moving around. Semi-nomadic is where you usually move seasonally, maybe one more time past seasonally. And then sedentary is where people stay in place. Of course, that doesn't mean that they don't ever, move homes, but you're not constantly moving longer distances on a regular schedule or on a perpetual basis, if you will. And because this need for nomadic lifestyle, because there's no agriculture at this point in time that has been developed, you rely on essentially following the animals that you're going to hunt, along with, of course, gathering foods and other goods that you need in the process. This ultimately means that hunting and gathering societies tended to be smaller, extended family groups. They're essentially the idea was that one person in hunting and gathering societies required 1 to 2.5 square miles of land for survival. So what this ultimately means is that they were smaller groups. Usually at the height of the Ice Age, when this was going on most extensively, 25 to 50 people. Right now, of course, this does depend on the location, and obviously one of the things that happens is that when the Ice Age melts and more waterways and plants and animals are available, the societies move to semi-nomadic, because the land can sustain people and can sustain the larger groups. And then agriculture, just to give you an idea, I'll put it up here, we'll put agriculture. 100 people can be supported by 1 square mile. So why you're able to then move into cities and urban centers and large populations is with the shift to agriculture, is because it can support a much larger group of people in a very small area compared to hunting and gathering societies. So very, very different lifestyles between the two with that, right? And within these hunting and gathering societies, it often required long periods of tracking. And then once they successfully, and in the height of the Ice Age, that was like large game, such as mammoths. This larger game is way too large to pick up and carry back with you, so then the whole group would move to that new location to set up camp, to basically break down the mammoth, which then they used for tools, weapons, clothing, meat. Pretty much every part of the animal was utilized for survival. The key with this is that production was necessary for survival, and in the past there had been long held assumptions that it was kind of structured. Men hunted the large game, women stayed at home, and that has been proven to not necessarily be the case. We do know that, we'll put here, some women hunted larger game as well. Now, that does not mean all women. There was a need to remain at the camp for those who were not the hunters, and women were still the larger majority of that, even though there were definitely women that were participating in hunting. And women also actively participated, all women, in hunting smaller game, right? If you were running low on meat and you needed to supplement while you're waiting for the larger game to be hunted, you didn't just go, oh, and we're hungry, too bad. No, they would go out and hunt small game to supplement in between the larger hunts and stuff like that. Women also gathered food, made tools, cared for children. They were often the ones that helped break down and set up the homes. They made clothing. They tended the fire. They cooked. Women participated in a significant aspect of society and were active participants in that production, right? And so what this gets us to is this equal status through production. Whoa. The thing with, and I didn't mention this, but the thing with prehistory is it's before writing, right? So it's this, they still had history, but historians have titled it prehistory because of not having the written word. And because we don't have writing, it's not been developed yet, you have to make meaning and understanding and interpretation based on archaeological evidence of more modern hunting and gathering societies and how we know they lived. There's a variety of things. Archaeological evidence is a big one. That's the art that's left behind. That's arrowheads that have been left behind. That's the small things you can find here and there from these thousands and thousands of years ago that give us clues into their life. But one of the things that we can say with significant certainty is that women were at least equal within hunting and gathering societies. And the way that you can kind of establish this is that status in society is based on not production, that's hunting and gathering, on the value. So for example, and this can be applied to any time period, any society. The value in today's society for us is money. The people who have more money tend to have a higher status in society. In hunting and gathering, that was production for survival. You had to produce or to survive. If you did not produce, your group did not survive. Well, women were active participants in all aspects of production, if not in some cases more involved in the day-to-day production for survival. Therefore, their status would have at least, we can say with certainty, at least have been equal, right? And so that's like the kind of starting point from that. With that, however, there has been some arguments that I think are valid. We can't prove 100%, but that have been argument that hunting and gathering societies might have been matriarchal in status. Matriarchal is the woman controlled. You have patriarchal, father controlled or male controlled, patrilineal, male line, matriarchal, woman controlled, female controlled, matrilineal, female line. And some scholars have argued that these signities might have actually been matriarchal because not only of the value that they were producing significant amounts for the communities, if not more than men at times, for day-to-day survival, but that the art that we have found and has been left behind gives us a look into the possibility that women might have been in charge. And this is through actually the fertility goddesses. And we're going to talk about it more in a minute here with this. But this idea that the fertility goddesses were these symbols that were connected to not specific like gods or goddesses, but religious beliefs and the power of the belief in fertility and the importance of the amulet. And we'll talk about again why we believe that this is what they are. And these are found all throughout anywhere that there's hunting and gathering societies. There are no examples of like male deities. There's no carvings left behind of male deities during the prehistoric period. And traditionally in societies, when it's a strong patriarchal society, the emphasis is on male deities with only a select few female deities. In matriarchal societies, more female deities emerge and play a prevalent role within that society. So here we have a situation where we know that women's value was at least equal in status. And then you have artwork with these fertility goddesses that suggests that there might, and a lack of male gods or deities, suggests that the emphasis on only these female fertility deities places a higher emphasis on women and women's roles within that society. Again, we can't prove this. There's not writing that says and lays it out for us that this might be, maybe there'll be some, discovery, in the future that shows this one way or another. Although, as we talk about the art today, I think you could argue that, the fact that there are more and more examples of how women were involved within the artwork in prehistoric period, plus the fertility goddesses, it is a reasonable argument to be made. But you can say with certainty that women were at least equal, and that there is a decent argument for potentially being matriarchal in structure. However, the other argument against that, of course, is just they were small groups. You don't really have any male-female controlled society in a small extended family group of 25 people. Having a more egalitarian structure makes more sense in those smaller settings. So, you can make arguments either way for that in that process and stuff with that. So that's kind of what I covered here with this. So what we're going to look at are the fertility goddesses, the figurines, and their significance, because it's one of the significant aspects of art that we do have in the prehistoric period. And the reality is we have limited art from this period, just because of how old it is. That even if they had created other art, there's a couple of reasons for this. I can put it here. Actually, let's put it here so I have space on the other one. Right. So one. The reason for, reasons for small amount of art. I mean, and I would argue that in some cases, we actually have quite a bit for the period, but just time, right? The prehistoric period was a very long time ago. The fact that anything has been preserved and remained from 60,000 years ago or longer is crazy in that case. I mean, part of it's stone, ivory, things like that. Those are going to be more enduring. But even then, there's plenty that were smashed to pieces. They found one that was in pieces they were able to put back together mostly. But how many pieces didn't survive, right? So we are going on limited knowledge of that. And then if you get into the cave paintings, which we're going to look at, the reality with those is that there probably were more cave paintings and other paintings and rock paintings that were done that faded with the elements over time, right? The ones that were most protected and sealed up from the elements and from people are the ones that then later were discovered and preserved. A good example of this is the caves in France. There's two main caves, and when they were discovered, they started opening them up and let people tour in them, and it very rapidly began to erode and remove, even without touching, the artwork. And they ended up sealing it up again, and they made a replica one, which is just as impressive. And if you ever want to visit, it's just as impressive. But it is the replica that people can safely go through and not, completely eradicate the original artwork. And that's just in a short period of time. Right, so the artwork is fragile, even in stone carvings, but even more so if it was out of wood or the paintings on rocks. Time erodes things, and thus the limitation on what we have. And then, of course, the fact that they were nomadic. This is also going to be significant towards the fertility goddesses, which are pretty small, like pocket size, amulet size. If you're constantly moving around, you can't accumulate a lot of stuff. You can't take it with you. That's why they don't have pottery yet. They had some baskets with weaving and baskets and things like that were much more portable. Pottery is heavy and hard and breaks. You're not going to carry. You can't carry multiple jars with you. You can't accumulate a ton of stuff and be able to move from place to place. Hunting and gathering societies that are nomadic naturally don't have a lot of surplus and a lot of goods that they collect, like we like to collect. And in my house, way too much stuff. I have way too much junk I don't need, right? And I would never be able to I don't even want to move to another house with the use of a car because of having to think about transporting some of the stuff that I have, the books, let alone anything else. So obviously that they have limited things that they're going to bring with them, and what they bring with them from place to place does signify an importance in those objects. So they weren't going to make a lot of stuff, and while of course you can leave behind some rock and cave paintings, in terms of like art that is going to be more prevalent in sedentary societies, that just doesn't exist with nomadic structures. So that alone from the beginning, right? We have the historical uncertainty of that, the fact that of course there is limited art because of those two components. So it is impressive, I think, even just what we have from that. So if we're looking at the fertility goddesses, these are a variety of figurines or statuettes that are relatively small and provides a glimpse into some of the belief systems of hunting and gathering, along with, of course, that these were all figures of women. And highlights, of course, some of the importance of women within hunting and gathering societies. If you look online, a lot the official name for a lot of these are like Venus of whatever, and then it's of whatever the name that they were, the location that they were found. It's like the woman of Willendorf is often called the Venus of Willendorf, and the reason for Venus is, of course, because it's the Roman goddess of love, and which is Aphrodite, the Greek goddess. They're the same goddess. And this was just given to it as an official name by some of the men who discovered some of the earliest discoveries of these figurines in the 19th century. And they connected them to the Roman goddess Venus because, of course, they were naked women. And a lot of the Greek and Roman statues were also, we'll say, naked or partially naked when it came to, we'll say, Aphrodite or Venus. Again, same goddess. The Romans stole the Greek gods, at least the main Olympians, and then they just gave them a Latin name. So like the Venus is Aphrodite, Aphrodite is Venus. But it's misleading because there's no connection to Venus. These figurines are not connected to obviously, they're way before the Greek or Roman time period. They're not connected to that goddess outside of the fact that they are women who are naked. But that's stuck. I prefer like women of Willendorf or fertility goddesses. Sometimes you hear them described as mother goddesses and stuff like that. But I think anytime like woman of the location or fertility goddesses is much more accurate than the Venus name for that. So I did put Venus here because, again, it is the official name, unfortunately, for most of these. But we could also say the woman of Hofels is actually the oldest known, the earliest figure dated around 40,000 years ago. And it was found in a cave in Germany and is 6 centimeters in height. The woman of Willendorf is 11.1 centimeters, 6 centimeters. So, right, with these, you know that they're small, right? They're meant to be put in your pocket-ish, and, they're portable. They're meant to be carried around. They're meant to be, this fertility goddess, she doesn't have a head and instead has a spot which they think would have been for an amulet to wear around the neck, right? So that none of these are large statues, right? They're all meant to be small in size because they're meant to be portable. This one was out of mammoth tusk. And the woman in Willendorf was carved from limestone. A lot of them were out of different stone or bone, and actually had red ochre added to the carving. It's mostly been rubbed off, but there's still a few traces and stuff on it that they found. So with these figurines, let's go here. You can see I like this one because it shows a variety of them. What do we know about them? How do we know, that they're, why call them fertility goddesses? What does it tell us about women in hunting and gathering societies that, this is the artwork that is survived? One, of course, we know that they're not just one-off artworks that have been made by someone, because again, there's a variety of arguments. The reality is that there's not 100% consensus on these fertility goddesses because, again, we don't have written record telling us what they are. So we have to make assumptions and connections based on knowledge base of what we have. I would argue, though, that these aren't just images of like, one suggestion was that these were self-portraits, that women were, making them of themselves. Or that artists were carving these just to carve images of women. But there's too many similarities between them, and they're found all over. Anywhere that there's, essentially anywhere that there is hunting and gathering societies, from nomadic to semi-nomadic, and even some early sedentary societies. As sedentary societies and agriculture continues, this goes away to the more refined, like Ishtar, Aphrodite, and Venus. That's different than the fertility goddesses. They play a very different role, even though they're still kind of the goddess of love, sex, and fertility. Fertility is still linked in there, but it's not the same as these. But these, so if there was just one found in one place, you wouldn't be able to say these were fertility goddesses or that this was their connection, because it wouldn't be enough information to make that connection. If we found a bunch of statuettes of women, but they were all, they didn't have any similar characteristics, it would be harder. You could still make this argument, but it would be harder to say that they were fertility goddesses. But so many of these, and they're all across the world, all within hunting and gathering societies, they've been found. So it's not one location. It's not, and it's with hunting and gathering societies. We found these women that have certain characteristics that would connect them to fertility goddesses. So within these figures, besides the small part, but that could just be because, again, societies are nomadic. So that doesn't connect to fertility goddesses per se, outside of, I guess, one area, which is that the small portable figurines were widespread and held cultural importance in polytheistic societies around the world. Roman, Greeks, things like that often had small, what were family or local gods and goddesses. And these would be put on their mantle in the house, and were meant to be small size that they would pray to, that were more specific to them than the state-sponsored deities, if you will, and that they could easily transport if they moved homes and things like that. So this is a standard tradition of these smaller size, which is where, again, if we're wanting to connect them to deities or a religious purpose, we see this similar structure used later on when we know very much what they're for. Right? But the other thing is that the characteristics, the fact that there are so many of them, that none of them are exactly the same, which tells us there's no organized religion yet. But yet they all have similar characteristics, which are connected to fertility and women. So, of course, with that is that there are an emphasis on large breasts, hips, and stomach, which often are signs and examples of fertility and childbearing, right? These are areas that you overemphasize to draw attention to because they are connected to childbearing and fertility in women and their bodies. The other part of this is the absence of not just facial details, but also, so lack of facial features, feet, and sometimes arms. right? Instead, the attention and on the body is the fertility related parts, right? The no head, no head, no head, no arms, missing the feet. And even when you have, this one is the most detailed in terms of having a unique facial features, which you could argue that this one might not be part of the fertility goddesses because you now have a more detailed facial feature that might be representing someone. But all these other ones, even when they have heads, right, no head, woman at Wildendorf, when they have heads, there is no distinct features except for this one here. Right? And they don't have, some of them have feet, some of them don't, a lot of them don't though. Some have like arms, some have, oops, I don't know how that happened, sorry about that. Some of them have arms, but some of them don't, right? Because the whole emphasis is essentially on the central part, over exaggerated, of areas that are connected to fertility and childbearing on women. This allows us to at least make, I think, a reasonable connection that these figurines represented the essential value of fertility that was so important for the survival in prehistoric times in hunting and gathering societies, right? Life was hard in hunting and gathering societies. You had to produce constantly to survive. You relied on the fertility, not just of people, but on animals and plants for survival. It is reasonable that those societies would have these fertility goddesses that they would use as amulets and charms, as statuettes to pray to hopefully promote fertility of the land and people, because it was so essential for that survival. Fertility in those areas meant you survived. Lack of fertility meant you did not, right? And not just in people, animals and plants, nature around them. All those areas of fertility were necessary for survival. And so those aspects together, I think, allows us to say with reasonable certainty that these were fertility goddesses. And again, there are other arguments about what these figurines are and their purpose. My argument is that this makes the most sense in terms of what we know about the structure of hunting and gathering societies, what we know about figurines in later societies, and what we know about how all of these are different and yet still emphasize the same features that in art later on, when wanting to emphasize fertility, focus on essentially over exaggerating and emphasizing those areas of breast, hips, and stomach, sometimes thighs, to highlight and suggest the fertility of that figurine. And that those are later in society are used in similar ways. So what's significant about this? One, all of the carving and statuette figures that have been found in hunting and gathering societies were women, right? And potentially seen as fertility goddesses or deities, right? No organized religion, just to be clear, there's no organized religion. Clearly, they're all different. If there was an organized system of religion amongst the various tribes of hunting and gathering societies, they would have more similar features, not just the generic fertility emphasis. But the fact that they're all women, and we have not found any male deities, and the fact that there obviously is a clear value and importance put on these images of women in hunting and gathering society, so much so that they were you spent your important resources and time carving these, carting them around, taking them with you, and we know that they were taking them with them based on the size, right? These were not left behind. These were carried and taken with them as they went from place to place, which places a value of importance on this artwork. And women are the central figure, and their role in childbirth and fertility as a central figure within early hunting and gathering societies, right? And thus why, the argument for a matriarchal society does have some weight to it outside of what we talked about already. but it certainly highlights that some of the earliest artwork in human history were women, were about women and women's role in connection to childbirth and fertility, and were seen as valuable and important and enough to take with and hold on to these things, and even take the time to make them, because carving these type of figures would take time to do, and certainly highlights this idea that women played a central role within the hunting and gathering societies. Now we have other aspects of art in hunting and gathering societies that also highlight the role of women, and that actually has changed over time. And that is what the small amount of remaining cave paintings that do still exist today. So the other type of art that is common in the prehistoric period is cave art. The oldest known cave paintings are found in Indonesia, dating back like 45,000 years ago. There is also petroglyphs, which there are a few places with those, which are carvings into stone. Usually petroglyphs are large carvings into stone. So there are those too. We aren't looking at the petroglyphs today, though. And those are a little bit later. They are not quite as old as the cave paintings. The most famous sites are the ones in France. Lascaux is probably the most well-known, but both of there's two cave sites in France that are the best known cave paintings in the region. And they're they come a little bit after the Indonesian cave paintings. Artists mostly used black pigment and red and black pigment. The red ochre for red pigment. These were, and the reason for this is, of course, that these were the easiest to find and use, which was from dirt and charcoal. So it made sense that they used what they had around them that would work to do that. There is a brown color too that was probably a slightly different dirt than the red ochre that was used in the more reddish style. So I guess the most common were the red and black, but you do have some brown too, but also just a variation of dirt that was used to mix sometimes with fat for a binding agent. And water and then you would grind it down into fine paste, mist, powder, I guess. Powder is probably, you'd grind it down to a fine powder, and then you mix in the water and then sometimes a binding agent to then be able to put onto the caves. And they didn't always use a binding agent, but in some places they did. So what was most commonly found in these, and then in some of them they also had engravings where you essentially carved into the rock and then painted. And actually, which is similar to what the ancient Egyptians do in the pyramids and tombs, is they actually did a light carving and then painted in the divot of the carving for that. Now, that's not as common as just directly painting onto the caves, but there are some examples of that as well. Most common things that were found in the cave paintings were animals, such as bison, horses, some deer, and bulls. So, and these were usually, there was a couple of birds too. Essentially it was animals that were, their wild boar was another. They were very much related to the location and what type of animals were there. This is and these cave paintings largely were as the Ice Age was ending. And so the larger game had gone extinct into the Ice Age, like 32 species went extinct. And these were all larger game: mammoth, woolly bison, saber-toothed tiger, things like that. And instead you had these still big size but smaller game than the larger game of the Ice Age. And obviously different regions and climates had different types of animals. The various cave paintings tended to reflect the animals in the region, along with nature scenes as well. These were the most common aspects of it. They also did show figures that were often hunting, but you do have dancing and just, we'll say, standing, hanging around probably, just hanging around. So there was a combination of that. There are a few that show like the process of passage of time as a hunter is going through the process of hunting an animal. But there were way more animals in nature scenes than people. So the number of figures of people was relatively small compared to the actual nature and human scenes that took place. For a good chunk of time, it was assumed that men were hunters and the creators of art on the cave walls, and believed that these scenes represented a couple different things. One was just daily life and what they saw, animals and nature around them. Another was to show the hunting activities. A third was a belief that it was a spiritual connection used with potentially shamans as a way that the caves were used and visited is in some kind of spiritual practice. Again, we can't prove any of these in any full certainty due to the lack of writing, but these are the different things with it. But it had long been assumed that men were the ones that were the artists, and that it was depicting mostly men. However, there's been other discoveries that show not only a suggestion that women might have been the artist, but also show women hunting and being part of the fighting and scenes as well, holding bows and arrows, being around a hunting scene, and then also we'll look at the hand stencils that suggest women might have been the artists too with that, which is this one here. So I'll come back to show. Oh yeah, I probably should have moved this other. Let's go to this one first. I was talking about women, showing women hunting and stuff. So I want to show them first, then we'll go to the hand stencils. I should have rearranged those. So here you have examples of women holding a bow and arrow. And this woman is not only holding, you can tell by the hair and the dress clothing. She has a bow here, and then three like long, they kind of look like spears, but are assumed to be arrows with the bow, right, which would indicate a woman in an activity of hunting and being a hunter in that process. And again, this before some of these discoveries and stuff, it was usually assumed that it was mostly men. And then in another scene, you actually have women shown with men circling a wild boar. And then we have this scene here where it has women with the bow and arrows, and they are moving towards what looks like, and this one only shows the one scene. I guess I should have put both, but there's another scene where it shows them looks like they're moving or running towards another group, which would suggest potentially fighting. So you have examples of women in art hunting and fighting, which again reinforces that women were way more involved in all of the activities and aspects of hunting and gathering societies than in the past it used to be believed. And then you also have this suggestion here with the hand stencils that women were involved in the actual creation of the artwork, that it wasn't just men that were creating the art. These hand stencils are unique because it's a completely different style of artwork than all the other artwork that we've looked at so far in terms of cave paintings. So all the other scenes where they used to draw on the animals or even the people hunting or standing around, right, that was just applied directly to with a stick or brush, or even potentially just the charcoal itself for the black directly onto the cave itself. But these hand stencils have two ones. A lot of these negative, you have both positive and negative shapes essentially here in the artwork that's used. And these ones, the negative shaped hand ones were used. We know that it was used by taking pigment. This is that red ochre pigment and stuff, and either blowing. So you put your hand on the cave wall, and then you would take the paint, and two ways they think they either did it. One was by putting it into like a hollow reed and then blowing into the reed and having the paint splat over the hand, which then makes the positive and negative shape. The negative shape is the hand here, which is that negative space, and the positive is the red all around it. Which that's a completely different technique than was used in the other types of painting. And then, or with these ones where they put their hand into the paint and then put it up on the wall itself. The other way, that if they didn't use a hollow reed, there's some suggestion they might have just put the paint in their mouth and also blown. But in both cases, it's the act of painting was actually blowing the paint onto the hand and the surrounding areas. And then if not that, dipping the hand into the ink and pressing it onto the wall. There's theories on like what these hand stencils mean. Theories such as that it was represented a signature. Some suggest it might be early communication or part of a religious ritual. For the signature, why there is some connection and thought to this is that, and I'll come back to this picture here in just a second. You can see the handprints here with the black, right? And so there's several faint handprints here, and in several of the cave paintings throughout where there's animals and scenes of hunting. Then there's these handprints. So right, this one is all just handprints on the wall, but there are other ones where there's other images and paintings of animals, and some believe that this might have been like the hunter's mark or the artist's mark, right? So that they were, after they had drawn and done the artwork, they put their hand and left that mark as their mark of their artwork. And I think that's any of these potentially, again, could be a reasonable argument for that. Communication is a little more vague on what it's communicating. Religious rituals is more likely, in my mind, it's a signature or mark, just a mark of this was me or I was here kind of thing, or connected to a religious festival or ritual that then they put their hands to do that. But the fact that we also have them, especially if this had been the only way that we'd seen it, but the fact that we have several paintings where we have scenes of animals in nature and then the handprints, that's where it provides that suggestion that it might have been more of something to say I was here or I drew this kind of thing. Now, these had long been thought to be done again by men. However, there was an individual who had been studying a variety of things, and one part of it was hand size and its connection to gender, and the realization through all this data collected that different measurements of hand, along with the certain lengths of certain fingers, were usually indicative of women over men, or potentially adolescent boys. So that's the other part of it, is that there's some that suggest like grown women versus this could be a woman's hand or this could be an adolescent boy's hand. But he went and ended up measuring several of these handprints in the caves and came to the conclusion that the majority of the handprints, not all, because there's like over 200 plus handprints throughout the various caves and stuff like this, but that many of the hand stencils seem to belong to women. And not all men as it was used to be thought, which would suggest and highlight right there, right, that women were involved in the creation of art, not just as subjects, but were active participants in creating artwork in the prehistoric period. Again, there's some discussion about, which could have been young boys versus women's hands, but based on his calculations, that there were quite a few that are pretty definitively based on at least his measurements and stuff would indicate that they were female hands. And of course, that means that not only were that women were participating as artists within, putting their hand on the cave, but that leads to suggestion that in some of these other artworks, that these also with the measurements some of these were women's hands as well, which would suggest, especially if the theory is that they were signatures or the mark of I did this or was here, that they were actually participating in the other artwork as well. So it's interesting, like I said, if you would have, talked about this artwork, 30 years ago, it all would have been all about men's roles within hunting and gathering society in terms of the artwork in the cave. And yet now we've had new evidence emerge that highlights what has really kind of been shown with the fertility goddesses and the fact that we knew women were equal in hunting and gathering societies, that women have been active participants in this from the beginning and were active participants in creating the artwork as well, not just as important depictions in artwork, but that were producing artwork. Of course, no one's writing's not around. No one's writing their actual name. We don't have artist names, but we do have enough, I think, evidence to show that women were participating in prehistoric art at the time. All right, we're going to transition then from that to Mesopotamian civilization and changes that take place. So, as hunting and gathering society develops and transforms, one of the things that emerges is that there is the development of agriculture. And agriculture, as we looked at in that other slide where I talked about how it allowed for large populations to emerge, it also, of course, created a stable food supply and population growth, which led to urban centers and societal shifts. One of the big things that agricultural societies do is that it creates patriarchal societies. There are a few examples where it doesn't, but the majority of societies around the world, when societies shift to agriculture, it shifts to a patriarchal society. The examples of when it doesn't are when women remain present in the food production. Because if we go back to status and value, the new value is agriculture, farming. That is where the money is. That's where the resources are, right? This becomes a new value. And the reality is that most women in these societies did not participate in the agricultural development and food production. And one of the reasons for this is because if you look at what disappears when you shift to from hunting and gathering to agricultural societies. It's the hunting of larger game. It's the constant need to go out and hunt to provide food. You now have farming and grain and domesticated animals that provide that basis. And with that, while women did participate in hunting and stuff, men were very much a part of that role. And if their main job is no longer there, it makes sense that they would take over the agricultural production, because women's roles were still present, taking care of the children, cooking, making clothing, tending the fire, all of these type of things. Those roles didn't change or go away. The issue is so while they were still producing just as much as they had been in hunting and gathering societies, the value had shifted from general production for survival to agriculture and farming for wealth and status. And thus men ended up gaining a higher status in society and establishing patriarchal societies, while women lost status and fell under that patriarchal structure. This ultimately gets connected to this idea of men not only dominating farming, but more importantly, the concept of land ownership, which didn't exist in hunting and gathering societies. There wasn't any reason to own land. You moved where the animals were, right? And so now that land is a valuable resource and people are owning it, and that the value is based on that agricultural land and men are the ones doing so, women's social status goes down and gets put under this aspect of land ownership. This also creates patrilineal societies, and this is, again, where it follows the father's line. Women move in with their husband when they get married, and their family They take on their husband's name. The children's wealth and status is followed through the father's line. And this is because, again, of land ownership. What this creates is a huge emphasis, and we looked at this in the Women in Patriarchal Societies reading, on women's virginity and marriage and control and structure of that, because it's important to know that your heirs are yours, and there's no DNA test back then. They could have just waited to make sure the woman wasn't pregnant, but instead what they did is they started putting a huge emphasis on virginity and then the taboo of premarital sex, so that it would be certain that the children that came from the marriage were the father's, because that lineage and that status and heirship was super important. Later, religion gets tacked on to the emphasis of virginity. But the whole idea of like virginity, women needed to be pure and connected to religion and all that stuff, that comes later to reinforce it. But it's a byproduct of that. And we know that because of matrilineal societies. Some Native American societies, women hold on to food production. And so they end up, while they're patriarchal, they're matrilineal. They move in with the mother's family. The status in line goes through the mother. And in those societies, there's no taboo on premarital sex or emphasis on virginity. It's easier for women to get divorced. All these type of things that are not because of religion, but are connected directly to agriculture and food production, right? So the one thing I'll say, and we're going to see this in the artwork for women, is that Mesopotamia was and Egypt too, and we'll see this in Egypt some too. They're the earliest societies. Mesopotamia and Egypt are the earliest civilizations to emerge out of hunting and gathering societies. And so they're in this kind of like transition period where women used to be equal in status, and now it's transitioning to a patriarchal, patrilineal society. The roles and control of women doesn't shift immediately. It's a slow process. And so you actually have women have more agency and authority and I'd say recognition in society, a protection under the law codes in Mesopotamia, than they do in later societies. Like the Assyrian society, women have no rights whatsoever. Greek society, women have no rights whatsoever. And that's because it's a longer period of time since that transition. But in these earlier societies where they're some of the first to shift to sedentary agricultural basis, you have this mixed remnants of women's rights and importance, recognition in society, along with the shift to patriarchal societies that limit women's control. And this again gets reflected in the art and how women are portrayed. So one of the most common ways that women are shown in, actually I think that I had it in here, no, I guess not, that they're shown in our work are in the cylinder seals, which is connected to writing and the development of writing. One of the last components of civilization is the creation of writing to emerge. Mesopotamia, ever so slightly, was the first area to develop writing. Egypt was right on their heels. The very first type of writing was the bulla, which was essentially this round, hollow ball made out of clay. And they would usually have these markings on it that indicated different things. And then they made these tokens that were just kind of geometric shapes. And these were all made out of clay. So this ball was hollow. Say hollow ball. And then this would be sun-dried, and it almost becomes as hard as stone. And they'd make these impressions when the clay was wet, and then you put those into the hollow bulla, and then the bulla would be hardened. And these represented various items that were bought or sold, such as livestock, land, or grain, right? And the tokens represented the numbers and stuff like that. And then this was all dried and hardened. So the first writing was actually about economic records. The problem with this is that every time you bought or sold something, you basically had to break open the hardened clay ball and make a new one, which is super ineffective. It also is limiting on what you can like record or write with. So it's not surprising that eventually the bula goes away, and cylinder seals emerge. And then the last thing is cuneiform writing. We're not going to really talk about that much. But cylinder seals actually stay around. So it's not like the bula goes away. Cylinder seals serve a different function in terms of writing and stay and continue alongside cuneiform writing, which is the actual writing that emerges that allows people to write like literature and stories and law codes and things like that. Cylinder seals were essentially your signature, your identification. They were made out of these different stones in the cylinder shape, and then there's a hole on either side that goes all the way through so that you can put a rope, and you would wear it often as a necklace. And then you can see within these carvings, I'll erase this, you can see the carvings in there. Each cylinder seal was unique to the person. And if cylinder seals could be expensive, so they also made these little stamps with a little hole like that you could put a little necklace on, and then there would be a single image on the bottom and you stamped it. But what you do for cylinder seals is you take wet clay, which is this here, and you would roll the cylinder across, and it would make an impression in the wet clay, and then that clay would harden. And what it created was its own artwork that represented your name or something that was important to you. And everyone in society had these because they used them for work. They used them to seal up when writing was fully developed. You'd write a letter. You could put a seal. You could put a piece of wet clay around the hardened cuneiform tablet and roll your seal to show that way no one else could read it. Another example, house inspectors in Mesopotamia, after they inspected the house and cleared it, they would put a piece of wet clay on the main door frame, entryway door frame, and then they'd roll their seal on that to show that they approved the house. And the law codes actually held them liable. If they said a house was sound and good to purchase, and then that house was not sound and collapsed, they were held responsible for that damages. So their seal was an important signature signing off on that you're saying, yes, this is indeed a legitimate, the house is sound and stuff like that. So within these, a lot of these seals depicted women in a variety of ways. And they were seen as goddesses, priestesses, royalty, workers, many showing different societal roles within that society. It showed them in daily life and various actions that women had within Mesopotamian society. One of the things that is significant is with the priestesses, women actually served as active priestess and worshipers and participated in temple rituals and led religious functions. And in fact, women were, once kingship develops, women were almost always the head priestess. There wasn't a head priest. The women were put in, once you became king, a way to justify their kingship was they would put their daughter, usually, as head priestess of the temple. And as head priestess, they ran everything. They were in charge of all the other priests and priestesses. They ran everything. They had a lot of power and authority. Even if you weren't a head priestess, becoming a priestess in Mesopotamia gave women a lot of freedoms that were not available to married women because they fell under the patriarchal society. So it actually was a way to gain some freedom. And several of these cylinder seals shows women as priestess and participating in activities and stuff. This one actually here is showing women providing offerings, which would have been part of that worshiper or priestess role. Right, so that's an aspect of it. They also showed women tending to animals. This scene is actually showing childbirth. This was more rare. We have a lot more cylinder seals that showed women weaving, tending to food, participating in trade. But this one is actually showing a childbirth scene and showing the importance of, obviously, whoever's this was an important part of their life, and they wanted that to be connected to them. But the fact that women were actively involved in again, tending animals, making pottery, weaving, trading, shows women were actively involved in the economic structure of Mesopotamia. We also have a lot of cylinder seals that show royal and wealthy women participating in government, receiving tributes, which showcases their power that they had, in part by birth, right? The royal, if you were a royal daughter or wife, was connected to somewhat luck in birth. But these women in these cylinder seals were shown having power and authority, right? That is significant in highlighting that. We also had motherhood. One seal, and I think it's the next one, shows a woman holding her child and people offering tributes to her. Maybe down here. One of these. I know I put it in here. There we go. It's this one. It's at the end. So here you can see it says you have a woman holding her child and other women attendants serving her. So probably a wealthy woman. It's not a priestess or a goddess, but again, the fact that you have these seals, this artwork that was used every day in Mesopotamia, highlighting the value of women and their roles in Mesopotamian society. We also have these here. This one is depicting women at a banquet and shows them eating and drinking. There's a harp-ish instrument being played, enjoying each other's company. And then this one we have a woman who it's small, but is being given a flower, and she's holding the flower. So again, just kind of daily activities. And then, of course, one of the other things that was common was Ishtar. Goddesses in general, but the main goddess in Mesopotamia that was portrayed the most in art and literature was Inanna or Ishtar. Now, Inanna and Ishtar are the same goddess. It's just used a different dialect. So I interchange Inanna and Ishtar. It's the same person or the same goddess. She was the goddess of love, fertility, war, and power. So you have a little bit of connection to those fertility goddesses of the past. And Inanna was again shown she was the favorite goddess, not just of goddesses but of gods too, to have literature and stories written about her. Probably because she was the most fun. You could write love stories, you could write revenge stories, you could write power stories, you could write stories about her going on rampages. She had probably the most personality out of all the Mesopotamian gods. And so people liked writing about her. And then you also have the connection again still to the importance of fertility and the land. There were several hymns of Inanna, the descent of Ishtar, which is all about showing the importance of fertility in the land and what happens when it ceased to exist, when Ishtar goes to the underworld. And you see a lot of cylinder seals. This is Ishtar right here. And it's dictating, of course, this idea of the other gods and the importance of the place of Ishtar in that society. Now, again, the emphasis of the poems, the artwork, and that type of thing was not, of course, that there was so much emphasis on one of the only. There were a couple other female deities that were main deities. There's in polytheistic religions you have main deities and then you have minor deities, and there can be hundreds of minor deities. But in the main deities, Ishtar is one of the few female main deities in Mesopotamia, and yet she played such a huge role in the art and literature of the society. And we also know one of the only women we know by name as an author is Enheduanna, which is significant. Authors did not name themselves in the ancient world, and yet we know stuff about her because in two of her hymns to Ishtar or Inanna, she named herself as the author. And we also know more about her, and because of that, she was a high priestess, and she was the daughter of Sargon, who was the Akkadian king. And he was actually the first king to unify Mesopotamia and make himself king of Mesopotamia. Sargon then puts his daughter as head priestess of Mesopotamian temple, and she had a massive amount of power and wealth. And not only that, but she wrote multiple hymns to Inanna Ishtar to highlight not only Inanna, but also highlight women. A lot of her writing is about the ideas of struggle, resilience, restoration, determination, and will of a woman, and coming through that. She was able to essentially highlight women's roles, their power, the emphasis on the importance of Inanna or Ishtar as a goddess, and their that complexity and strength and connection within society. And that's significant because she was well known, not only for her work, but in her time. There are other artworks that mention her by name and highlight her, which shows her influence and power within the Mesopotamian society. So she played a significant role in kind of highlighting women's role within Mesopotamian society. This is another artwork that's not a cylinder seal, but a stone carving of Ishtar, again emphasizing her power. Owls are often connected to wisdom and power, but highlighting her as, again, this important deity within society. These are the tablets that are with the hymn to Inanna. These are this is what cuneiform tablets look like and writing looks like. Well, large ones. The day-to-day tablets were actually pretty small and handheld, but when anyone was writing like larger literature, they tended to be actually larger stones and stuff most of the time because you had to have the space to do it. Same thing, you shaped these wet clay into rectangles or squares. You used a wedge-shaped stylus to indent the characters into the wet clay, and then you put it out in the sun to harden into like a stone-like substance and stuff like that. So, and this is kind of what I already went over and mentioned and stuff like that. So I got ahead with the other one and went over this. But again, the importance of this is that her work was super popular and prevalent and being referenced in the artwork, and that highlighted women's roles within Mesopotamian society, right? And then ultimately from this, what we can tell is that the portrayal of women in Mesopotamian artwork shows that despite the shift to a patriarchal society and the limitations that created with their loss of status, women were an important part of society and managed to find agency and power within that society, which we can see through the artwork, right? Which emphasizes women's roles in not only the other parts of trade, but that they were able to exercise power and influence within the patriarchal system and gain agency in a patriarchal system. And we wouldn't necessarily know that. We probably would be saying more that women were just under this strict patriarchal structure with the law, Hammurabi's law codes providing some minimal protections. And yet the artwork shows us that that's not necessarily the case, and that because this was a transitionary period, women were able to carve out and highlight and showcase themselves as being active participants in the society, having agency, having power, and having some authority within that system. And that the cylinder seals especially highlight and showcase this as a valued aspect of their roles within that society. All right, that's where we'll end today. And we'll be looking at Egyptian art and